When I moved to the US from Singapore, I remember people would often ask me, wait, is it true that you can't chew gum in Singapore? And I'd be like, is this the only thing you can think of when I say Singapore? But you know what? It made me realize something, that people often reduce entire cultures to one single strange sounding exotic detail. And that exotic detail becomes that culture's entire identity. And when it comes to India, one of the most enduring and disturbing of it is Sati, widow burning as it's often called, where a Hindu widow throws herself into her husband's funeral fire. To many in the West, it became the symbol of Indian tradition, this horrific alien ritual, which is proof that India needed to be saved. But here's the truth. Sati was not common and it was not mainstream at all. So how did the story become so big? Obviously, the more exotic something sounds, the stickier it is in people's minds. Sati was dramatic, emotional, and terrifying to outsiders. It captured the colonial imagination, especially among British officials and missionaries. It even made its way into fiction. I remember when I was younger, I read this book called Around the World in 80 Days, which is about this British hero who travels around the world, and when he gets to India, he sees this Indian woman about to commit sati. She's about to jump into the funeral fire of her husband, and so he goes and rescues her and then marries her. But what was crazy about the story was the name of this Indian woman. So her name was, wait for it, Auda. I repeat, Auda. That's not even an Indian name. It was just a name concocted to sound Eastern to the people reading the book in Europe. So much for researching India that they couldn't even get the name of this Indian woman to sound Indian enough. So what is the actual history behind Sati? According to British records, between the years of 1815 and 1828, there were only 8,000 recorded cases of sati being performed in Bengal, which was only 0.07% of the population. And if you look at larger British-occupied India, there were only 4,300 cases recorded between the years of 1817 and 1828. This was 0.002% of the population of India at the time. So as you can see, this was extremely rare. And here's what's even more telling. When the British banned sati with Regulation 17 in 1829, the British themselves admitted that the practice of sati was very rare, condemned by many Hindus, and not even required by Hinduism. The regulations stated, the practice of sati is revolting to the feelings of human nature. It is nowhere enjoined by the religion of the Hindus as an imperative duty. Despite its rarity, sati is still taught in many classrooms in the West as a defining aspect of Hinduism. I had a chance to speak with Arushi, a Hindu American who remembers how sati was brought up in her world history class.
It definitely was there. Like, sati was presented in class, but I think it definitely was presented as a prevalent social evil in Hinduism without talking about like, oh, like this is how it went up and down, or like it just seemed like it was a bit random and out of context.
So it's now time to unpack the origins behind sati. In Sanskrit, sati means a virtuous woman or a devoted wife. It really has nothing to do with the fire. In Hindu belief, the soul is eternal and reborn. Some women may choose to join their husbands in death, hoping to reunite with them in their next life. So this was known as anugamana or sahagamana, and it was always framed as voluntary. The scriptures never required it. In fact, there were many texts that discouraged it. There's even a Rig Veda hymn that tells widows to rise up and return to the world after mourning their dead husbands. But a mistranslation changed everything. In that Rig Veda hymn, the Sanskrit word agre, meaning first, was mistranslated to agni, meaning fire, by a 16th century writer. That error was then later on picked up by F.D. Colebrook in 1795, who argued that the Rig Veda sanctioned widow burning, or sati. His reading was then challenged by many other scholars like William Jones, who believed that the Rig Veda did not say anything of that sort. Take Mahabharata, for example, which is one of India's most famous epics. When King Pandu dies, his two wives, Kunti and Madri, are faced with the same decision. The sages and elders in the family advise the two of them to not follow their husband into the funeral fire, especially for the sake of the children. Kunti chooses to live and raise the children, while Madri decides to join her husband because she felt personally responsible for his death. But the point is that both their choices, both Kunti's choice to live and Madri's choice to join her husband, were both honored. There was no judgment by anyone. There's a Mughal-era poem that describes a bride who chooses death when her fiancé dies on her wedding day, even though Emperor Akbar offered full protection to her, but she did not take that. Then there's Queen Yashomati, who enters the fire even before her husband dies, saying, "I am the lioness mate of a great spirit. Compared with the flame of wifely sorrow, fire itself is cold." The attitude in ancient India wasn't blind glorification of widow burning. It was very nuanced, and the choices that Kunti, Madri, Queen Yashomati, and the Mughal-era poem bride made were all respected. And think about even today, we debate topics like euthanasia, bodily autonomy, and personal agency. And ancient India was no different. There was always dialogue, disagreement, and debate. There was no one monolith that told the story of Sati. Some thinkers like Trayambaka from Tanjavur in 1700s believed that women who did perform Sati received higher spiritual blessings. But he also agreed that if women chose to live, that's acceptable as well. If you look at the writings from that time, some people praised Sati for being this noble act. Others condemned it. There were yet others who believed it wasn't a religious duty at all, and some others who said it was just a personal choice. But the point is, it was not one single story. And contrary to popular belief, Hindu texts also discuss widow remarriage. The Parashara Smriti discusses Punara Vivaha, or widow remarriage. Even the Manusmriti, which is a text that most people see as orthodox, talks about widows being under the care of their sons. Now, obviously that doesn't indicate leaping into the fire with their husband, does it? Even social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy used Hindu scriptures as the basis for opposing Sati, not Christian ones. He called it a corruption of Vedic dharma. Now, it's true that widows were asked to live simple, austere lives when their husbands died, but that wasn't something that was unique to Hinduism. In 17th century England, widows wore black for the rest of their lives and lived in isolation. In ancient Rome, widow remarriage was legally discouraged. Society eventually evolved. Women pushed back, expectations changed, and that's what happened in India as well. So how did this rare voluntary custom become this global symbol of Hindu barbarism? To understand that, you really have to look at who was telling the story and why. And the story of Sati wasn't really told by people who were trying to understand India, but it was shaped by those who were trying to control it. If you look at the writings of early European travelers in India, they were really fascinated by the Indian marriage and the devotion that exists between husband and wife. Jean-Baptiste Tavernier wrote about how Indian husbands rarely cheated. Alexander Knox in 1753 wrote about how widows chose Sati even though it was not legally required or even required by families. Pierre Sonneray saw Sati as this act of pure love and grief. In the 18th century, Europeans often saw Sati as a voluntary act and compared it to Christian martyrdom. The Dutch traveler Rogerius comments about how the Indian woman about to commit sati seemed less distressed than the European onlookers who were watching it. American traveler Benjamin Crowninshield was amazed at the courage of these women. But in the 19th century, all of this changed. Enter the Clapham sect, a group of British evangelicals whose main goal was to try to Christianize India. Members included William Wilberforce, who led the abolition of slavery, Charles Grant, a director at the East India Company, and Zachary Macaulay, a missionary and father of the infamous historian Thomas Macaulay. Yes, all of these individuals did commendable work in trying to end slavery. But you also have to take into account that they looked at Hinduism as a dark, evil, and degenerate faith that needed to be wiped out. Their goal was to paint Hinduism as corrupt and depraved to justify colonialism and Christian missionary effort. And what was the perfect tool to use to accomplish this? Of course, Sati. Wilberforce even argued in the parliament that Sati was worse than slavery in America. At the time, the East India Company, which was the British company that had just taken control of India, was hesitant about interfering in Indian religion. But under pressure from the evangelicals, they finally opened the doors to them. And then missionaries began flooding Bengal, and writers like James Mill published books about how Hindus are superstitious and savages. Pamphlets began claiming that 10,000, 50,000, or even 100,000 women were dying of sati every year. These numbers were completely made up, but they were being used to raise funds and increase moral outrage. Pamphlets that were circulated by missionaries like William Carey talked about horrific stories of Sati happening, but with no names, no dates, and no corroborations. Ironically, while missionaries were accusing Hindus of burning women alive, Britain's own history includes the public burning of women accused of witchcraft as recently as the 18th century. I had a chance to speak with historian Dr. Meenakshi Jain, who has written this very fascinating and eye-opening book on Sati, and I asked her how Sati became so central to colonial propaganda. She notes that these accounts were less about evidence and more about emotion, designed to reinforce the narrative that Hindus needed saving.
There is a Frenchman, Duperon. He came to India. So Duperon, he wrote an account of Sati that he saw in Pune. But the French library, it had his notings on the margin. And he said that in this case, I failed to tell the truth. So I wrote about it because the home audience wants to hear sensational things. Otherwise, why will they buy my books?
In 1829, Governor General William Bentinck officially banned Sati in the Bengal presidency. And you know what happened? Nothing at all. No riots, no mass protests, no cultural collapse. As Dr. Meenakshi Jain puts it, it was a truly universal case of prompt compliance. Meanwhile, the real catastrophe was famine, which was killing tens of millions of Hindus. But that was obviously not useful to missionaries. After all, you really can't raise money or justify conquest by talking about British grain exports during droughts. Can you? I don't think so. So let's recap. Sati was never a widespread Hindu practice. It was rare, it was voluntary, and it was debated within Hindu tradition. It was never mandated by the scripture, and it was absolutely not celebrated by all Hindus. Colonial missionaries turned this rare custom into a moral indictment of the entire civilization. And that's what happens when one strange detail gets elevated into this defining story of a civilization. It's like reducing Singapore to the chewing gum ban, except in this case, with the distortions of Sati, it helped in justifying conquest, cultural erasure, and internalized shame. But you know what? This damage wasn't just historical. It still shapes how the world sees India, and most importantly, how Indians across the world see themselves. If you learned something new from this video, I'd really appreciate it if you like, shared, and subscribed to this video. And till then, I'll see you in the next video of Samyu Speaks.